You would assume that being a composer would be your instant route to fame. Going bust, not like this, but like this. Well, that's not the case, even with our most famous composers. Bach, for example, was known when alive more as an expert on organs, that's musical ones, not medical ones, than as a composer of music for them. Beethoven and Mozart also were at different points in their lives more famous as performers of music than as writers of it. In this video, I will reveal music's 5 greatest amateurs and the reasons why not going pro might actually have helped. Robert Schumann had always intended to be a performer, a piano player, which, interestingly at the time, was still a job with more fame attached than merely being a lowly composer. Take Liszt, remembered today as a composer, but fated during his life as a great performer, or ditto more recently, Sergei Rachmaninoff, which, when you think about it, is still the case today. Contemporary performers, far more famous than contemporary composers. Anyhow, Robert Schumann was on that path to become a fated piano performer when, in his early 20s, he started to experience problems with his hands. He tried multiple treatments, including homeopathy, electrotherapy, before, unfortunately, settling on this quack cure, which was supposed to strengthen his hand, ended up damaging his right hand to the point where he had to give up his dream of becoming a virtuoso pianist. And so, Schumann retreated into teaching and composition. His career's loss ended up being our own gain. I have to say, there's an almighty whiff of amateur about all the famous 5, the mighty handful, that group of composers that came together in 19th century Russia. The man that brought them together, Balakirev, was the most professional of the bunch, although he started out not studying music but studying law. Even so, he was the only fully professional musician when the group first met. Of the others, Cui was an engineer. Before becoming a musician, he was actually responsible for the construction of military fortifications. Another of the 5 also had a military background before becoming a composer, Rimsky-Korsakov, who was a naval officer who had travelled the world before settling down to teach and compose. Mussorgsky was a civil servant, or at least some kind of government functionary. In fact, it's probably more accurate to term him a professional boozer. But my choice of most professional amateur of the bunch must go to Borodin, who certainly believed himself first and foremost as a scientist and only a composer in his spare time. His work in organic biology is still recognised today, including demonstrating, wait for it, nucleophilic substitution. He also founded the School of Medicine for Women in St. Petersburg, where he also taught. Music, for Borodin, throughout his life, always took a backseat to science and education. As he himself said, "Music is a pastime, a relaxation from more serious occupations." He also said, "Respectable people do not write music or make love as a career," which makes me think he might not have had a great opinion of OnlyFans. My next choice is a surprise for me, since Telemann is one of the most successful Baroque composers. I believe he's actually in the Guinness Book of Records as most prolific composer of all time. Well, that's despite the fact that he did not start early. Even to be a composer, he had to fight against his parents' wishes. Well, actually his mother's, since his father had died when he was just 4. His mother was convinced that Telemann should be a lawyer, and so Telemann studied law. However, he secretly, yes secretly, took lessons and secretly composed, just so Mummy wouldn't know. Eventually his success at music meant reconcilement with his family, and Telemann was no doubt successful, so successful in fact that twice in his life, he rejected jobs which were afterwards accepted by none other than J.S. Bach. So, according to Baroque contemporary views, Telemann was a better composer than Bach, and even his mother couldn't argue with that. Next choice is a famous amateur, Berlioz. Berlioz's dad was a doctor, and Hector was meant to follow in his father's footsteps, so he studied medicine for several years. The story goes that when Berlioz turned up at the dissection room and saw a body actually being cut up, he jumped out of the window immediately and ran to the musical conservatory. Well, actually that's Berlioz's own version of the story, and Berlioz was a man who did exaggerate a lot in life and in music. This, after all, is the man who called for 6 timpani drums for his Requiem. However, the general truth remains the same. Berlioz, over the course of a couple of years, abandoned his medical studies and took up music, which meant, very unusually for a 19th century composer, Berlioz had no official musical education. He didn't even play the piano. However, was there an advantage in his amateur roots? I might call this the Rousseau effect. That's not named after the philosopher, but rather the then customs officer come painter, known as Le Douanier Rousseau. His lack of a classical formulaic education in painting gave his work a fresh, primitive style that lent it originality and panache. And you can see a similar thing with the paintings of Vincent van Gogh, or, as he's pronounced in Dutch of course, Vincent van... Anyway, perhaps something similar happened for Berlioz. Perhaps his lack of a formal education gave new life, particularly to his orchestration. As he himself said, "It saved me from the tyranny of keyboard habits, so dangerous to thought, and from the lure of conventional harmonies." And it worked. Even in his own time, Berlioz was recognised as a master. Paganini knelt before Berlioz in front of an entire orchestra after hearing Harold on Italy for the first time, and declared him a worthy heir to Beethoven. Coming from Paganini, that was rare praise indeed. So, there you go. You don't need to play piano at 2 and get a conservatory education to become a great composer. All you need is to be a once-in-a-century genius. Easy. To finish, I'd like to mention the American composer Charles Ives, who, first and foremost, followed a career in insurance. Indeed, he started and owned a highly successful insurance company, Ives and Meidek. Ives was your classical amateur musician, only composing in the evenings after he'd finished work. Ives wasn't really noticed for most of his compositional career, only really starting to get recognition and attention towards the end of his life. But there's a sad and perhaps ironical end to his musical story. One day in early 1927, a distraught Ives told his wife he could compose no more, saying, "Nothing sounds right." Although retiring from the insurance business in 1930 and living another 20 years in retirement, Ives would compose nothing new before dying in 1954. Perhaps working as an amateur composer had actually helped his work. The rest, as they say, is silence. Oh, and to break that silence for a commercial plug, I'm starting a new channel about art and culture called Enjoy Culture. It's going live in 2 weeks, but do go over and subscribe now to be ready for that first video in a fortnight. Links in the video description. Thanks.